this last video, we're going to talk about the Ballata, which had the sort of biggest mix of French and Italian influences. So for some background, the madrigal and the caccia would have been composed by university-trained clerics, right? The musical literati that we've been talking about for the last couple of chapters. And the madrigal and the caccia, those genres would have performed at court for the nobility. And they would have, these guys competed like trouvères. I mean, it's all in that troubadour and troubadour tradition. Now, the ballata emerged from the Italian folk tradition. So ballata means danced song. And for a while now, we've been connecting the popular side of things with dancing versus the elite side of things, which is not for dancing. And because of the ballata's humble origins, right, the popular aspect wasn't as initially as interesting to the musical literati. It started to get more attention after Giovanni Boccaccio wrote, wrote the Decameron, which is kind of like the Canterbury Tales, and I believe was actually a bit of an inspiration for the Canterbury Tales. In the Decameron is basically set when the plague was active in the 1300s, and a bunch of young men and women are kind of out in the countryside, cooped up in a house, trying to keep themselves busy until the plague sort of plays itself out in the city. And so every day they tell each other stories, and then at the end of the day they would sing a ballata. And so, this was an important work of literature in Italian, and it caught folks' attention, and so people started treating the ballata as a more sophisticated kind of music. And this is actually kind of a little bit similar, the ballata is a little bit similar to the French virelai that we talked about. Virelai was also kind of initially low prestige. Virelai were sometimes called chanson baladée, which means danced song. And if you look at if you compare in the textbook, the Italian ballata actually has the same form as the French virelai. And, we saw the way that the virelai could be kind of fancied up by adding polyphony, or at least we talked about that. And in Italy, Francesco Landini, who was the greatest musician of the back half of the Trecento, he kind of took an interest in the ballata, like I mentioned, and elevated it to a more prestigious genre. And part of the way that he did this was by combining the traditional Italian elements with French techniques, and French stuff being kind of the definition of fanciness at that point. He was different from the earlier madrigal composers in that he wasn't a university-trained cleric. He was actually a blind organ technician. And his audience wasn't nobility, but rather wealthy businessmen because of where he was. There wasn't a court. And so we end up, poetry-wise, we don't have this kind of high-class canso or even the kind of earthy, pleasant place poetry that we talked about last time. The poetry instead is more about personal feelings, right? So let's take a look at the text real quick. So if we skip down. She will never have mercy, this lady of mine, if you do not see to it, love, that she is certain of my great ardor. He's basically asking Cupid, or the embodiment of love, to communicate to the woman that he loves her. If she knew how much pain I bear, for honor's sake concealed in my mind, only for her beauty, other than which nothing gives comfort to a grieving soul, perhaps by her would be extinguished in me the flames which seem to arouse in me from day to day more pain. And then the refrain again. So again, as I mentioned, exactly like a virelai. One thing that I'll point out, the difference in this poetry between the canso or the pleasant place stuff. The woman that he's talking about isn't higher class or unavailable, like she would be in a canso. It totally seems like they might end up getting together. But she's also not, naked in a pond, right? Like in the pleasant place poetry. This is just a guy kind of hoping that his crush notices him. Now, musically speaking, like I said, we see this combination of French and Italian styles. So one thing already from the French tradition is the fact that the ballata is basically like a one-stanza virelai. We also see a three-voice texture, right, with a cantus, a tenor, and then contratenor. That was a French thing. Another thing that we see are sort of open and closed phrases that we've talked about before, where you will have phrases that end on the note adjacent to the final, and then at the end of the next phrase, they will end on the final. Things that are Italian are the personal expression, like I mentioned. This was a new kind of sentiment to see in poetry. And then if you look, you can see melismas and then word clumps, and then melismas again. That was typical Italian stuff. And then maybe the most Italian thing of all was something called the Landini cadence, which you can see all over the place in here, starting here. And this is a great example of a mix of styles. From the French side of things, what we have is that kind of inverted accoursys, where we go from F sharp to G in one voice and A to G in the other voice, right? In this case, a major sixth moving in contrary stepwise motion to an octave. That is a traditional French kind of thing. But what we have here is we don't go straight from F sharp to G, we go from F sharp to E, like that sighing figure that I mentioned in the madrigal, right? That has that kind of, that personal feeling aspect to it. So we end up with this yodom instead of yodom, yodom, and we see it there, and we see it here, and we see it here, sort of all over the place. So yeah, the Landini cadence, you get the sigh, then the accoursys. Let's listen to just a bit of this so you can hear all of the things that I just talked about. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Apologies, folks. Let's try this one. All right. So, the upshot here, there's this sort of flare of creativity and originality in Italy in the 1300s, but these genres kind of vanish in the 1400s, although they will resurface later. One guy I was reading talked about this like a meteor flashing across the sky. But the big thing, this more permanent thing that we're going to see coming out of this is this interaction between styles, the French style and the Italian style in particular, and the way they're starting to blend together. And then what we get in the 1400s is a truly international style that has all of these hallmarks. It gets used by basically all the trained composers throughout Europe, and this is when England really starts to poke its head in and shake things up.